There are 642 different weapons in Warframe, and with so many ways to mod your gear, you can find a way to implement any gun or melee into your loadout. However, with so many weapons to choose from, there are bound to be a few that aren't exactly up to par with the rest. Enter the Stug, one of the few weapons in the game historically to be genuinely terrible. The Stug is basically a souped up squirt gun, firing little balls of explosive goo that increase in size as they connect, dealing up to 10 times the Stug's base damage on detonation. Unfortunately, that 10 times multiplier doesn't mean a lot when the Stug had a whopping base damage of 4 and had such horrible crit and status stats that, despite all of the tools at your disposal, the Stug just couldn't really be viable. That all changed just 2 weeks ago though, with the release of the Stug Incarnon. Many weapons have access to a quote-unquote Incarnon mode, which offers huge base stat buffs and a chargeable alt-fire. For most weapons, the addition of an Incarnon is a huge buff, and the Stug is no exception. With the Stug's Incarnon, it can reach a base damage of over 300 and can gain massive status and crit buffs depending on how you decide to build it, turning one of the community's biggest jokes into a genuine powerhouse of a weapon. I knew that the Stug was strong, but I still wanted to give it a little bit of a stress test. Conveniently, I also realized around this time that, despite the fact I've played for around 8 years, I still haven't really done that much of Steel Path, Warframe's quote-unquote hard mode. That's why I decided I was going to clear every single mission in the game on Steel Path difficulty with only the new Stug Incarnon. But before we begin, if you haven't already, consider subscribing. It's a great way to support the channel and tells me that this is the kind of content you want to see. With all of that out of the way, let's find out if the new Stug Incarnon can actually handle all of Warframe. For this challenge, the rules are pretty simple. The only weapon I can have equipped at all times is the Stug, and I am not allowed to use damaging abilities for my Warframes unless absolutely necessary. I am allowing myself to bring companions for utility purposes, and for the majority of the playthrough I chose to bring Diraga as it's one of the best priming companions in the game. I have to complete every single mission node that is required for Steel Path completion solo, excluding Archwing and Railjack because unfortunately, you aren't allowed to use the Stug in outer space. Otherwise though, I'm allowed to play any frame that I want and build my Stug however I see fit. Beginning on Earth, things were incredibly easy. Not only is this the easiest content in the game, but the Stug is already proving to be a much more competent weapon than it used to be. Where it used to struggle at doing, well, anything, it now excels. With my first build, I chose to go all in on status effects, going for as much status chance and status damage as I could. I slapped on a mod for big heat damage, which can completely strip armor from enemies when paired with corrosive, which the Stug carries innately. Of course, armor stripping enemies doesn't matter as much if they burn alive before that newly lowered damage resistance can even take effect. I also have an Arcane equipped, which gives me one of the single largest pistol damage buffs in the game as long as I continue to proc heat effects, so it's no surprise that at this low of a level, things kinda just die before armor stripping can even mean anything. Most mission types, especially at this point in the game, are incredibly easy. Exterminate and Survival just have you kill a bunch of guys, Capture has you kill one specific guy, Spy and Rescue missions have you sneakily breaking into locations to steal stuff, and missions like Defense and Mobile Defense have you defending objectives from waves of enemies. All of these objective types are pretty doable with any frame you'd like, although they can be made much easier with a proper pick. For example, I chose to play frames like Avara for the majority of my Spy and Rescue missions because her ability to cloak herself and pass through trip lasers and barriers with an augment made these missions insanely easy. However, there is one major outlier of the bunch that had me worried from the very beginning: interception. Interception is like if they took domination from any FPS game ever and decided that it should be f***ing stupid. Players contesting the point actually doesn't mean anything, because enemies, no matter how many there are, can capture even through conflict. This doesn't apply the other way around, as even a single enemy on the edge of the point will completely halt capture progress for players. This would be fine if it weren't for the fact that Steel Path forces 4-player spawn rates no matter the size of the party. Due to the sheer volume of enemies, I couldn't really get between points fast enough to keep multiple captured, and for a short time, I was at a loss for what I should do. Eventually though, the gears started to turn in my brain, and I came up with a solution. For the majority of the playthrough, I played Atlas. His main ability is to punch things, but since that's banned, I mostly played him so that I couldn't get staggered while I was on the ground. I quickly realized that he wasn't going to work for interception though, and I eventually landed on playing Cora. Cora, aside from having a really big cat that follows you around and fights for you, also has a very strong crowd control ability in Strangledome. When enemies walk into it, they get strung into the air, and enemies on the outside of the dome start to feel really bad and ignore their objective and start shooting their friends. The damage from this is pretty negligible, but that doesn't matter when the dome keeps enemies from contesting the point and keeps enemies from making a meaningful push. As an added measure, I crafted up a bunch of weak specters, all carrying a Stug of course, and would pop one at the start of each mission to watch over a point for me. They weren't very good at their job, but their gunfire would at least let me know that something needed my attention before the point was actually being contested. With all of this in mind, interception got easier and easier, and eventually it wasn't too big of a deal. Do I still dislike the mode? Of course I do, but at least I know how to handle it pretty well now. Aside from my first few interceptions though, Earth didn't really serve as much of a challenge. Even my first assassination mission against Vayhek, a normally really annoying target, didn't matter all that much. He kinda just dies to AoE damage, which is thankfully something the Stug is incredibly good at. With Earth down, I moved to Venus where I faced more of the same. The switch from Grineer enemies to Corpus did bring a handful of challenges, but it was nothing the Stug can't handle. This unfortunately wasn't true forever though, as I came to the first roadblock of the run at Fossa, the assassination node on Venus. This mission has you take on a Jackal, a very large robot, but generally not too big of a deal. Normally, you just shoot out their legs, making them do a little spin before giving you a finisher window. Do that 4 times and the fight ends, right? Unfortunately though, the Stug has one fatal flaw in this fight that complicated things far more than I had ever expected. For some reason, the Jackal just doesn't take damage from the Stug, like 90% of the time? The embedding of projectiles doesn't do any damage, and neither do the explosions from embedded shots. Very rarely though, I would see a damage number or two, and I eventually found out that, for some reason, only explosions from non-embedded projectiles could deal damage. The incarnate mode of the Stug makes explosions launch out extra bouncing goo balls from where you shoot, meaning I could basically mag dump the floor to deal some pretty good damage. After a couple of close calls, I eventually finished off the Jackal and wrapped up Venus as a planet. At this point, I had played for around 3.5 hours, and seeing as it was around 2 AM, I decided to wrap up my session and head to bed, just a little bit worried about the future of the run. I'm still so early into the run, and I'm running out of ammo against one of the easiest bosses in the game. If the Stug is already struggling this early on, then what's gonna happen with some of the genuinely difficult assassinations in the future? I don't know, but for now, there was nothing I could do but get some sleep and come back to the game with a fresh state of mind. Day 2 of the challenge saw 2 sessions, across which I knocked out all of Mercury, Mars, and Ceres, as well as the first half of Deimos. The bosses at this point of the run helped restore my faith in the Stug after I absolutely dumpstered Vor, followed by another easy assassination against Krill, and a final mission against both of them at the same time, despite the fact that they should both already be very dead. Mars turned out to be the single longest planet in the game, with a grand total of 17 missions required for completion. Fortunately, the majority of these missions are pretty short, with only a handful of defense, survival, and interception nodes to deal with. However, Mars is also home to one of the single longest mission types in the game, Mirror Defense at Tiana Pass. Mirror Defense is like a normal defense mission, but instead of clearing out 3 short waves of enemies, you had to sit for 2.5 minutes through an infinite wave before going on a little stroll, and doing it again for another 2.5 minutes at a new target. It takes around 5.5 minutes for a single rotation of this mission, which, while it isn't that bad for me since I only have to go for 1 round, is an absolute pain if you've ever needed to farm for any of the rewards from this mission. Moving away from Mars though, Deimos is interesting. Deimos is broken up into 2 parts, the Derelicts and the Sanctum, which vary wildly in level from each other and become accessible at incredibly distant parts of the game. As such, I chose to complete the Derelict missions first before completing the Sanctum at the end of the challenge. Most of these missions were quite easy, as is the case with most infested tile sets, though the assassinations against Lephantis and the Zealoid Prelate both took a really long time to complete. Lephantis is pretty tanky and is also immune to status, meaning I couldn't stack my Arcane's damage buff. Thankfully though, this was partially negated due to an incredibly convenient cluster of enemies just outside of the arena, which I could use to proc heat to boost my damage. Zealoid Prelate is unfortunately just a really long and annoying fight, although it honestly wasn't as bad as I expected it to be. You have to run around the stage to hunt down these little baby zealots who drop an incredibly bright lamp that allows you to damage the boss. After dealing damage, the boss enters a healing phase where you have to kill trash mobs to prevent it from healing, rinse and repeat until it's dead, earning you a part of a really cool glaive and completing one of the more annoying assassinations in the game. Finally, on Ceres, I was reminded that Hijack is a game mode that exists and is one of the few mission types that only appears on a handful of regions. Hijack requires you to escort a giant thing that you're stealing along a track, draining your shields to push it along. For these missions, I chose to play Horo, since he has incredibly good shield sustain through his first ability and generally makes Hijack missions go by pretty quickly. I then proceeded to forget I was playing him for the majority of the planet before finally switching back to Atlas near the end. Haro is great, but many of his abilities are built around making enemies easier to headshot and making headshots stronger, and unfortunately for me, the Stug is incapable of headshotting, so back into the arsenal he goes. Aside from Hijack though, not much of importance here happens aside from the double feature assassination of those guys who should be dead. After running the Abyssal Zone for fun, I wrapped up the day with 3.5 new planets done and renewed confidence for the future. On day 3, I knocked out Phobos before taking a break to go spend time with some of my friends, confident I would be ready to lock in the next day. On day 4, Deltarune Chapter 5 came out, and so after 15 minutes of working on the video, I Alt F4'd my game and went to go play that instead. Finally, on day 5, after wrapping up Deltarune and playing a little bit of Overwatch like the chud I am, I finally got back to work. Now that I have made it to Jupiter, I've considered myself in the mid-game of the challenge. At this point, I was roughly a third of the way done, and to celebrate and to encourage myself to keep going, I made a small 150 platinum purchase of a Riven mod for my Stug. Rivens are randomized re-rollable mods that, for the right weapons and with an insane amount of luck, can offer absolutely insane bonuses to your gear. Thankfully, due to the Stug's former reputation of being the actual worst gun ever, nobody ever used it, and so the Rivens it can roll are some of the best in the game. After spending my life savings in Kuva to re-roll it, I landed on plus status, chance, and multi-shot roll and decided to keep it for the time being. Buying this was completely unnecessary, but at this point I'm too committed to the bit to stop. Jupiter was another really long planet, being tied with Sedna for the second place overall, although it wasn't too big of a deal. Jupiter is also one of the few planets to be home to 2 assassination nodes. On Themisto, you get to fight Alad V and his weird little robot, which is easy enough. However, the Ropalolyst was a much more problematic fight. This boss requires you to use your operator's amp to lower its shields so that you can force it into these giant fly zappers, making it vulnerable to damage. Sounds easy enough, except for one little thing. Its weak points, much like the legs on the Jackal, are completely immune to embedded projectiles from the Stug. This time though, because the boss is pretty tall and the weak points are much smaller, it is damn near impossible to hit it effectively with the Stug, even in Incarnate mode. I spent all of the ammo that I had before eventually giving up and backing out of the mission. I'm sure that with really optimal gameplay, it's possible to clear with just the Stug, but I wasn't looking to spend a ton of time to figure that out. I loaded back in with a burst in to clear the first 2 phases, and finished off the 3rd phase with the Stug when the Ropalolyst's entire body became open to damage. So on that note, I unfortunately didn't sweep all of Steel Path with only the Stug, but I'm in too deep to stop now. Moving on from Jupiter, Europa was a mostly uneventful region, although it did hold the only Corpus Hijack node in the game, so that was kind of interesting at least. The boss fight against the Raptor is one of the easiest in the entire game, and after knocking out the rest of the planet, I wrapped up day 5 with my 8th planet finished, still just a little bit pissed off about how the Ropalolyst went, but hopeful that it would never happen again. Day 6 was by far the longest section of the challenge. Over the course of 8 hours, I knocked out Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Eris, taking up the majority of my day to clear a whopping 79 missions. Saturn, aside from having a relatively lengthy and pretty annoying fight against Sargus Rook, is also home to one of the 3 defection nodes in the game. Defection has you take these Grineer, who don't want to be Grineer anymore, and escort them out of an infested derelict. The defectors are usually pretty slow, but thankfully they're affected by speed buffs, meaning that with a full-strength Volt build, I can click 2 and watch them sprint to the point in record time. Aside from that though, Saturn was pretty uneventful, as are most regions at this point to be honest. Thankfully though, Uranus, Neptune, and Eris all have completely unique game modes tied to them, those being Ascension, the Index, and Infested Salvage respectively. These modes, as short-lived as they may have been, were really nice breaks from the monotony of this challenge. Ascension sees us going up a really long elevator and fighting to keep it powered using power cells dropped by enemies, as well as these jumbo cells that are hidden around the map and are used to accelerate the elevator. Infested Salvage has us fighting hordes of infested so that we can enjoy the lovely scent of a humidifier, and the Index allows you to drop hella bands gambling on Bloodsport. All in all, despite just how long the section was, at least it had some pretty interesting mission types to help keep me sane. I ended day 6 shortly after clearing Eris, hell-bent on wrapping up the challenge tomorrow on day 7. From Sedna onward, I considered myself to be in the endgame of this challenge. At this point, the levels were finally getting to be pretty high, and my choice of frame was actually starting to matter. For most defense and mobile defense missions, I pretty much have to run a frame like Korra to redirect attention from the point, as otherwise the objective just gets shredded. The Stug is still handling things quite nicely at this point, although it is worth noting that I have had to change up my build just a little bit. Aside from the Riven mod that I purchased earlier, I also bought Primed Fulmination from Borrow, increasing my explosion AoE by a nice 44%. Sedna is home to the arena nodes, which were the only point of the playthrough where I chose to play Revenant. These missions aren't hard, but I got ganked by status effects one too many times, so I just swapped to Revenant so I could use his patented I can't die anymore button and cleared the rest of the missions out without issue. I was also a little bit worried about Sedna's assassination node, as during the fight you have to shoot these little spinning buttons. Considering the Stug's history of not being able to shoot precision targets, I just swapped to my Drifter and used my amp to clear these sections out. Otherwise though, Sedna wasn't too difficult, and it was the longest remaining region by a long shot. I haven't mentioned it until now, but I've also been completing sections of the Void as they become available, and with the completion of Sedna, I can finally knock out the Void as well. From here, we have 5 regions remaining: the Kuva Fortress, Lua, the Zariman, the Deimos Sanctum, and Holvania. I didn't realize until this point that Lua and the Kuva Fortress were actually pretty underleveled compared to Sedna, but I don't think it matters at this point. The Kuva Fortress was the first time I was forced to swap elements on my Stug, moving from a heat build to a shock build. Kuva Grenier have a 50% heat resistance, and while I'm sure I could have brute forced it with the heat build anyway, I didn't want to take that chance. Aside from the build change, the Kuva Fortress and Lua were both pretty quick and easy, although I will note that I spent 20 minutes doing Lua's spy mission because I had to look up a guide. It's also worth noting that Lua is home to the single highest level mission in the game, with Circulus reaching up to level 200 at base. I have a deep-rooted beef with this node due to how much I had to play it to craft Varuna, and despite the recent changes DE has made to make farms like it more tolerable, I just can't get over how long I had to sit here just to drop 3 Varuna blueprints in a row, forcing myself to buy the rest of the components. With Lua down though, the Zariman was up next. At this point in the game, I finally decided to put Atlas to rest in exchange for Dante. As much as I love Atlas and the quality of life from his passive, Dante is just a far more survivable frame and will fare much better against the upcoming content. The Zariman is the single shortest section in the game, with only 5 missions to complete, so I was in and out in pretty much no time at all. I re-equipped the shock build I used for the Kuva Fortress here, and from this point on, I never swapped off for the rest of the run. Despite the sheer damage buff potential from using a heat build with Cascadia Flare, using other arcanes like Secondary Enervate to increase my crit output is far more valuable with this build, especially considering that now after around 80 rerolls, my Riven mod now gives a pretty comparable flat damage bonus, rendering Cascadia Flare just a little bit obsolete. Zariman has 3 unique game modes in Void Flood, Void Cascade, and Void Armageddon. Void Flood is the easiest, having you run around to grab these blue orbs to seal void ruptures. I didn't know it until I was playing for this challenge, but the amount of orbs required actually scales with player count, meaning you can get incredibly fast rotation times if you play solo. Void Cascade has you activate these pylons and keep them defended from Grenier and assorted Voidborn horrors, and Void Armageddon is kinda like Mirror Defense, but if you just tossed in a little bit of balloons. All of these modes are actually pretty fun, and I was really glad that I got to play some of the more unique content in the game after the past 30 some odd hours of playing normal missions. With the Zariman completed, I started chipping away at the Sanctum, but that was when I remembered something. At the start of the week, I completed about half of my Duviri circuit so I could unlock the Stug Incarnon, but because I was too locked in on completing this challenge, I had completely forgotten to finish the second half to get my second adapter for the week. I didn't really want to wait over 2 months to get another chance at grabbing the new Vectis Incarnon, so I took a break for the night to knock that out instead. This unfortunately meant that I would have to spend one more day to wrap things up, but that would be a problem for me to face tomorrow, on the final day of the challenge. I had 12 missions to complete on day 8, and I wasn't going to take a break until I was done. Starting out on Deimos, I knocked out the one and only alchemy mission in the game, as well as my second and final mirror defense node of the run and the assassination against the Fragmented Tide. From the moment I started this challenge, this boss scared me, since I wasn't sure how the Stug would stack up against it or if it really could at all. I was pleasantly surprised then to see that it handled the boss quite well. It did respectable damage, and, as I expected, was really good at clearing out the trash mobs that spawned during the fight. With Deimos finally complete, I had one region left to beat, Volvania. Using the old-ass computer in your orbiter, you can time travel to the year 1999 in the beautiful city of Volvania, giving us 8 more missions to complete for Steel Path completion. Most of these mission types are just rebrands of existing missions, Hell Scrubs are just survivals, but if you had to pay a little bit more attention to the life support pylons, Stage Defense is just a normal defense node, but if David Bowie was there, and Legasite Harvests are like capture missions, but if they were just a little bit more interesting. Face Off, though, is actually a really cool node unique to Volvania, where you go through a series of random objectives and try to beat them faster than an opposing squad. Unfortunately, though, the PvP version of this mode isn't required for Steel Path, and even if it was, I couldn't queue into a game anyway, so I never really got the full experience. All of that, though, leads up to the final assassination of the run against the HO9 Afervon tank at Victory Plaza. At this point, I was over 35 hours deep into this challenge, and I was ready to finally wrap things up. That is, until the worst thing happened. I'm sure you remember the Jackal and the Ropalolyst, right? I don't know what it is with the Stug and weak points, but embedded rounds just can't damage the nodes on the top of the tank. If I get really lucky, I can destroy the side spots by shooting underneath the tank, but the ones on top are effectively immune to the Stug. Running low on ammo, and with no other option, I was forced to use Dante's Exalted Tome to destroy the top weak spots and proceed with the fight. Going into the tank's second weak point phase, paratroopers started dropping into the arena with RPGs, so I started using those to break the weak points instead. With that, I was able to knock out the remainder of first phase with no issue, and entered the final phase of the fight. Now that the tank has revealed itself to actually be a giant pile of tech rot, I can literally just shoot it. It also helps that, for once in the run, a boss's weak points are actually vulnerable to the Stug, meaning it was only a matter of time before the tank fell for real, and the challenge was finally done. And what do I get? A goddamn pizza. So how did I do? In total, I played somewhere in the realm of 240 missions over 35 hours across just about 8 days. I killed over 47,000 enemies with the Stug and gained over 34 million XP in the process. Despite this, the Stug still isn't my most used secondary, because for some reason I chose to use the same kit gun as my sidearm for around 5 years. Overall, I had a ton of fun playing with the Stug for this challenge, and I'm glad that after all this time, it's finally getting the love it needs to be viable. Am I ever going to do anything like this again? Probably not, but I'm glad that I did it either way. If you've made it this far into the video, then consider subscribing so you can see more of my content in the future. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching.